Um, Thank you all for joining Darien Library this evening. Tonight we have the good fortune to be co-sponsoring this program with the Museum of Darien, an evening with Allegra di Bonaventura discussing her book For Adam's Sake, a family saga in colonial New England, an intimate history of family and slavery through the lives of intertwined Connecticut families. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that programs at Darien Library are made possible by the annual Friends of the Library campaign. We thank you for your support to make programs like this, as well as our collections available to the community. And tonight, if you have questions, if you could put them into the chat or the question and answer section, I know Allegra will be happy to answer them for you. And now I'm going to turn the mic over to Maggie McIntyre, the Executive Director of the Museum of Darien.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you to the Darien Library for co-sponsoring this event and virtually hosting this evening's discussion. I'm so pleased to introduce to all of you this evening Allegra di Bonaventura, as she discusses her phenomenal nonfiction work For Adam's Sake, a family saga in colonial New England. This impeccably researched and beautifully written book centers on the lives of two early New Englanders and their interwoven families. At the core of the narrative is a diary kept from 1711 to 1758 by Joshua Hempstead, a New London shipwright, farmer, and magistrate. This diary, combined with supporting documents uncovered in the course of her research, also reveals the story of Adam Jackson, an enslaved husbandman whom Joshua owned for more than 30 years. With a heightened attention on racial issues today, this book's focus on the experience of enslavement in the colonial North is particularly relevant. Allegra di Bonaventura is the Associate Director of Graduate Programs at Yale Law School and previously served as the Associate Dean for Graduate Education at Yale's Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. In 2008, she received a PhD in history from Yale, and she also holds a law degree from Yale Law School. Her work For Adam's Sake, published in 2013, won the New England Historical Association's James P. Hanlon Book Award and the Association for the Study of Connecticut History's Homer D. Babbage Award. For Adam's Sake was named a Wall Street Journal Best Book of the Year for 2013. On a personal note, I discovered this wonderful book while on vacation in Vermont at an independent bookstore. It's one of those rare history books that reads like fiction, and I literally could not put it down when I started reading it until I turned the very last page. But please don't just take my word for it. Joseph Ellis, also one of my favorite authors, author of Founding Brothers, said the book is the only account of such psychological depth I have seen in all the family histories of New England. Impeccably researched, elegantly written, For Adam's Sake is a model of its kind. So it is my sincere pleasure to welcome our guest this evening, Allegra di Bonaventura.
Thank you so much, Maggie and Pat, for what a wonderful introduction. I don't know how I'll go forward after that. It's absolutely wonderful to be here. Thank you all for giving me this opportunity. And now I'd like to take you on a little adventure, take you back into the world and the life of 18th and 17th century colonial Connecticut. And our guide this evening will be this document, this diary, which Maggie told us a little bit about. So here it is in the flesh. This is the diary of Joshua Hempstead. And it gives a remarkable window into one man's life, his family life, his home life, the life of his town, and local events, even sometimes international events, but mostly local, over more than 47 years of his life. This is what the diary looked like. This is just one section of the diary. It actually is a number of books, but you can see he was very assiduous and very frugal in his use of paper. So I came to this diary as an historian of family and domestic life. And I was very interested, particularly because it was a man's diary. And I wanted to put a lens on a man's life, looking, instead of the way historians have sort of traditionally focused on men's public lives, I wanted to put a very intense lens on his private life. So his domestic life, his family life. What was it like to be a father? What was it like to be a son? What was it like to be a grandfather? You know, because this covers his entire life. A husband. You know, how did we have a lot of notions about how men behaved, and this diary provides this extraordinary window into how did one very ordinary man actually live his life as a head of a household and a head of a family. Now, the diary is very, I think, extraordinary and unique, kind of for two reasons. First of all, it's very long and it survived, which is incredible. So he probably kept it for more than 47 years, but we have a little over 47 years that still exists. So that's one thing. Number two, it's very unusual for us to have a diary. I don't know of another diary of this depth and this length from an ordinary man like this. So this is a shipwright, he's an artisan, he's a farmer, he's literate, obviously, but he is not literary, and he's not a merchant, he's not a minister, he's not university educated, he's not a member of the elite. So here we have a window into an ordinary man's life. And I thought it might be fun, if I can get my screen to wake up. Here we go. For you to just take a peek, take a peek here. And we can take a look at, let's just take a peek at Saturday the 15th. So it's near the bottom of the page. And I'm just going to read a little bit for you. Saturday the 15th, fair. That means the weather. It was a fair day. I was at home all day, drawing wills, etc. So that means he was literally writing people's wills, last wills and testaments, which he did for money. He was also a magistrate. Now we have Sunday, 16, fair. So another nice day. Mr. Adams preached all day, and I was at meeting. And it's a little blocked out by the pictures. It says, and something better. So what does that mean? Mr. Adams was the minister. He preached all day. That means the Sabbath was divided. There was a sermon in the morning and a sermon in the afternoon. It was a very long day. And there was a break for lunch, which they called dinner, in the middle of the day. Mr. Adams preached in the morning and the afternoon, and Joshua tells us he was there. He says and something better. That means he wasn't feeling that well, and he's feeling a little better. So when you get used to his abbreviations and his lingo, you start to know what he means. Now, turn down to the second to last line, and we'll get a very important piece of news, although you wouldn't be able to tell from the script. My daughter Elizabeth was married to Daniel Starr in the evening by Mr. Adams here. Here meaning in the house, in the Hempstead house. So that's a perfect example of, for most of us today, the wedding of one of our kids would be kind of a big event. You might have it be in bold print or something. This diary is a farmer's diary. So it's an almanac style diary. And this is part of the reason why it didn't become super famous. It wasn't the kind of diary that professional historians really paid a lot of attention to. There's a lot of weather. There's a lot of farming, planting corn, chopping wood, going to meeting, that kind of thing. There's a lot of repetition, and there's a lot of abbreviation. So it's a little bit of a cipher as well. So those are some of the reasons why, even though it's quite an extraordinary document, it's not the sort of thing that really until the late 20th century historians were looking at with any kind of seriousness. So let me just escape out of there. Okay, so that gives you a little flavor of what the diary is like. There's no emotion, it's all facts. He only one time in the diary, in the entire diary, even when family members die, he doesn't emote. But one time in the diary, he does emote, and it's sort of a spiritual statement. So it's really about the facts, about work, about weather, and documenting sometimes his accounts, his working life. So Joshua, I told you, stepping back a little bit about the Hempstead family. He was an artisan. He was a farmer from an ordinary family. He was a third generation New Englander. So his father also was born here. His father was a wheelwright, and his grandfather came from England, and he was a blacksmith. So again, these are not elite people, not highly educated, but very, respectable congregationalists who came from England. Now, an ordinary guy, but there are two extraordinary things about Joshua that make him particularly interesting to study. One is, of course, this incredible diary that he left us. The other is a tragedy that he suffered relatively early in his life. So he got married when he was around 19 or 20 to a young woman that he knew from Long Island named Abigail Bailey. And they proceeded to have quite a happy and successful, prosperous young married life, and had 9 children, so 6 sons and 3 daughters. Now, when Abigail was 38, they had their 9th child, which was a little girl named Molly. And very tragically, within a few days of Molly's birth, Abigail got a fever and died, leaving Joshua the sole parent to 8 children, including a newborn. Within a week of Abigail's death, their eldest son, Joshua Jr., 17 years old, also died. So within the space of 1 week, Joshua's life kind of, imploded, and he faced the loss of 2 of the most important people in his life, his wife, and also the care of all of these children. And what I find to be probably the most admirable thing about him is that he spent the rest of his life utterly devoted to his surviving children. Was a very hands-on father, very companionate, loving, caring father who did the best that he could to give them a good start in life. That now his tragedy, though, is our opportunity, because what it meant also is that Joshua had to deal with family affairs and domestic life and the care of his children much more than other men would have, because he was a widower. He never remarried. And so in the diary, it's a particularly rich window into family life from a man's point of view that we normally would not get even in another man's diary, because he was a widower and had no companion. So I embarked on this study hoping to write this very intimate portrait of a man in his diary. This is actually an image from Joshua's actual house, which has survived, and which is a historic house museum in New London. And, after the coronavirus is over, I recommend that you go and have a look. Now, so here I was about to write this book about this man, intimate portrait, family life. But as I delved deeper and deeper into the diary, I kept encountering another person, another man, a man named Adam Jackson. And Adam was Joshua's slave. He lived in this house too for more than 30 years. The 2 of them shared this house for more than 30 years. And when I first encountered the diary, I had no idea that Joshua was a slave owner. And the more I read about Adam and his role in the house, in the family, and I knew what an important part of this book he had to be. But I was also very aware that it was highly unlikely that I would be able to say very much that was meaningful about Adam's life. I mean, you saw what the diary is like. It's hard to get at Joshua's feelings. Can you imagine, how are we ever going to get at Adam's feelings through the lens of his master or through other sources? I mean, Adam is an enslaved, illiterate person born in 1700. Nevertheless, I thought, well, at least let me try to find out what I can. Pulling out all the entries in the diary about Adam, it came to over 50 pages. I was astounded. And I realized that Adam Jackson might very well be the best documented enslaved person that we have from this early period of American history. So again, born around 1700. And then looking at other sources, I read about 100 years of court records, town records, et cetera. I found that I was able to trace not just Adam's life, but his parents, his siblings, and even back to a grandparent. And by looking at Adam's life and Joshua's life together and their families, these two third-generation New Englanders, they were both third-generation New Englanders, defied many of my notions that I had about a New England family life that I'd come to this work with. And it was then for Adam's sake that I wrote a very different kind of book. Now, stepping back for a minute, obviously, with this introduction, there was slavery in New England. And in fact, Rhode Island, and particularly the region of the Narragansett, was kind of a center of slavery in New England. New London County, bordering Rhode Island and the Narragansett, ends up being the area of Connecticut that is kind of the hot spot of where slavery kind of spilled over from Rhode Island, the practice of slavery at much higher levels than we see in other parts of Connecticut. So it's kind of not a surprise that our story is happening, that Adam is here in New London. And because if you look at all of Connecticut, New England has much higher rates. New London has much higher rates of enslavement, of enslaved people living there than you will find in other parts of Connecticut. So let me tell you a little bit now about Adam Jackson and his family and what I found out about this third generation New Englander. So I'm going to start with his grandmother. His grandmother was named Maria. We know very little about her. But she was bought as an enslaved teenager, probably in the 1650s, brought to New London, Connecticut, enslaved, and spent the rest of her life enslaved in a very wealthy family in New London, the Rogers family. Now, we do know one tiny poignant fact about Maria. She's always described in the records, or repeatedly described in the records, as Maria deaf and dumb. So Maria not only had to suffer, enslavement, removal, taken to a new climate, new place, a new kind of enslavement, having to adjust to all of that, but she also may not have been able to communicate easily with other people. We also know Maria had a child. So in the 1670s, she had a child named Joan. So Joan is born in Connecticut, raised in Connecticut, an enslaved daughter of Maria, also in the Rogers family, this wealthy family. And Joan actually gets married when she's in her late 20s. And she marries a man named John Jackson. Now, John Jackson, like Maria, Adam's grandmother, was brought to New London as an enslaved 18-year-old in 1686 from the West Indies. And John ends up being a pretty remarkable man. And he spent the first couple of years that he was in New London enslaved and working as a stevedore, essentially, at the harbor of New London. And then he becomes the property of the Rogers family, the same family that owned Joan. And that was how Joan and John met each other and they got married. So they actually lived in two branches of the Rogers family. So they actually had to live apart. And that was not that uncommon for enslaved people. They might live in different households, but they would still try to maintain their family life across households. So this was the case for John and Joan Jackson. And I have to say a couple of words about the Rogers family. So this is the family that owned the Jacksons. So they were a wealthy mercantile family, but they were also pretty unusual because one of the Rogers family's sons, John Rogers, founded his own Sabbatarian Baptist sect. It's actually the first indigenous English American sect in the United States. And it was called the horrible name, I mean, the very not creative name of the Rogerines. So, and the Rogerines were very radical Baptist in a very orthodox theocracy of Connecticut. So John Rogers brought his religion actually from Rhode Island, where there were a lot of Baptists, and he brought it into Orthodox Connecticut. He spent the next 30 years in terrible conflict with civil and religious authorities. And he would do things like barge into the meeting house in the middle of the sermon, pushing a wheelbarrow and selling shoes to try to break up the Sabbath. The Rogerines were accused of burning down the New London Meeting House, and they probably did it. They were also accused of daubing feces on the Stonington Meeting House, and they probably did that. So they were pretty unusual people. This was the environment that the Jacksons lived in. And the Jacksons, John and Joan Jackson, Adam's parents, were actually probably most likely Rogerines themselves. So, and I do think that that actually affects how they react to some of the things that happen to them later in life. So they get married. They're described in the first 10 years of marriage, the Jacksons, Adam's parents, as prosperous. They live on their own farm. They have a number of children, actually 6 children in the first 10 years. But here was another tragedy. Adam and Miriam, who was Adam's little sister, were born in the first 2 years of the Jacksons' marriage, when they were living separately, when they were enslaved in separate families. Now, the Rogers and the Rogerines were actually some of the first people in New England who began to get the idea that slavery might not be a good path. So there is some evidence of them freeing some of the enslaved people that they own. And among the people they freed were John and Joan Jackson. So you think, oh, wonderful news, Joan Jackson is freed. Well, here was the tragedy of it. Joan already had 2 children. Because she was a slave, when those children were born, they remained slaves in perpetuity. And even though she was able to join her husband in freedom and live on a farm and have a life with him, she had to leave Adam and Miriam behind, enslaved children. So Adam grew up close to his parents, a few miles away, but living separately, enslaved as a child, and trained in the work of a husbandman. So learning how to be a farmer and also to do animal husbandry. And he was very skilled, clearly very skilled husbandman. And he lived his entire young life with a branch of the Rogers family as an enslaved person. And then in 1727, he was around 27 years old at that time, Joshua Hempstead, our diarist, he purchased Adam. So this is actually another image from inside the house. This is what Joshua called his chamber. So his room, kind of his personal room, although he often had kids sleeping in the trundle bed with him. And this is actually the room that I think he wrote the diary in, and that he spent really I think he was probably born in this room and he probably died in this room. So a very small world. So Adam came in 1727 to this house. This is the house from the outside, the Hempstead house in New London. And this will give you an idea of what the environment was like. So if you look at this picture, the red door, everything to the right of that red door in that section did not exist at that time. So you just had the red door entryway and then this left-hand part of the house, which was a main room at the bottom, Joshua's chamber at the next floor, and then a garret chamber. So essentially 3 large rooms with a kitchen in the back. When Adam arrived at 27 years old to become the only enslaved person in this house, there were already 10 people living there. And those included Joshua, some of his kids. One of his kids was married and his wife was there, 2 of their kids. And Joshua also had his elderly and dying mother living in the house. So when we think about sort of the space or the domestic space in which slavery is happening, privacy is not part of that. People are on top of each other. And I've actually spent the night in this house, and I can tell you, you can hear everything in the other rooms. So historians have sometimes called New England slavery family slavery, which is somewhat of a fraught term, but it comes from these kinds of close settings and domestic environments that all of this is happening in. And, you know, historians have talked about whether that's from the perspective of the enslaved person, whether that could be better or worse. I mean, whether or not those are even arguments to be made, I don't know. But just a couple things to think about. Because the space was so limited, there was less differentiation in terms of the way people lived, the enslaved person versus the master and his family. But there was also, it meant that for Adam, every minute of every day that he's in this house, he is under a foot of his master and his master's family. So a different kind of oppression, I think. So something to think about. A little bit about Adam's work. I think his life as an enslaved person, husbandman, farmer in New England was extremely typical. So he just did the whole entire range of farm work on the farm. Often, a couple facts that sometimes we find surprising. He was often working alongside Joshua or other family members doing the identical tasks. So that's also what I meant by not as much differentiation as you might see in larger scale slavery. He also had quite a high degree of autonomy in terms of the tasks that he did and how he did them. He would go to different parts of town. He had enormous responsibility, actually, and was highly trusted by Joshua to take on very serious and very, important work for the farm and for the family. Now, going back to Adam's parents, I just want to wind up a little bit with a little bit flavor of their story. So I told you that they had lived quite prosperously for 10 years and things were looking really quite good for them. They were free, although they lived with the perpetual tragedy that the Jackson family would always, like many most African origin families in early New England, their family, their children straddled freedom, slavery, and servitude within one family. And even moving between these statuses, which made it extremely difficult for them to hold their family together. And yet they did. And let me tell you the lengths to which they went to do so. In 1711, they'd been together for about 10, 11 years. And the family was tragically broken up because the Rogers family, I mentioned how they were a very radical religious group. They were also very argumentative amongst themselves and litigious. And so there are a lot of lawsuits, which is great for a historian, I have to tell you. But one of the strands of this litigation was tragically over the Jackson family and ownership of the Jackson family, even though they had been freed. And in 1711, one side of the family won a court case and they won ownership of Joan Jackson, who was pregnant with her 7th child, and another of the Jackson children. So all of a sudden, 1711, after living, a very nice family life, Joan, her little son, Jack, and she's pregnant, are taken to Long Island, re-enslaved in another branch of the Rogers family. And how does John Jackson react? He fights. And you have to consider, this is 1711, not 1811. He's a penniless freeman. He's illiterate. And what he does is he gets in a boat with his former master, sails across Long Island Sound in the middle of the night, breaks into the house and steals his wife and children back, and then sends them into hiding on Rhode Island. Now, the story goes on from there, but that gives you an idea of the measure of the man. And he ends up having to fight for his family for another 2 decades. But I will tell you that he was largely successful and had, in fact, some really notable victories, both in court and on the ground. And one thing I just want to show you is this is evidence of this extraordinary man and this extraordinary struggle. So this was something, and I was very excited. This is the closest I ever got to John Jackson. This is an appearance bond. After he stole his wife back, he had to sign a bond saying that he would appear in court. And here you can see his signature is a mark, the mark of John Jackson. That little squiggly circle is his signature. And there you see it. It's happening in May 1711, and he's fighting for his children and his wife back. So really quite a remarkable man and a hero, I think. So, what these colonial families really showed me were that they were intertwined from every social stratum by bonds of law, religion, work, neighborhood, even blood. And this, although I can't go into it in detail now because we don't have time, but this was true, just as true for the elite, I found, the Winthrops and the Livingstons of New London, who feature prominently in my book, as it was for ordinary families like the Jacksons and the Hempstead. So I'll close with this image of this room, which I find kind of symbolizes some of those intersections. This is the Garrett Space in the Hempstead house. And this, we believe, would have been the space that Adam, where he would have slept for more than 30 years of his life when he was enslaved in the Hempstead house. So I'd love to take any questions. That just gives you a little bit of a flavor of.
Great. Allegra, one of our attendees, Barbara, is asking, wouldn't Joshua, when he did not marry and chose to take care of his 9 children by himself, Barbara's asking, wouldn't most men have found another wife?
Barbara, you are more than correct. Not only did most men find another wife, but historians have done sort of statistical studies, and they found the rates of remarriage are way in the high 90 percentiles, first of all. And usually it's within less than a year, particularly for a man like this with so many children. And the reasons, aside from loneliness and grief and whatever, are really obvious, which is the work in a family was divided along gender lines. So, so Joshua faced an enormous deficit of labor by losing Abigail in terms of the care of his children, the running of his household, and how he goes about filling that, because he didn't. It's really an extraordinary choice, incredibly unusual. And I have some theories about why he made that choice.
Okay. And Barbara has a second question, which is, did John and Joan legally marry? And could they do that?
Yes, so that's quite interesting. Yes, the answer is yes, they did legally marry. And I believe that they married in the Rogerine church, which is why there's not a record of it. But they were clearly, in all legal papers, they're identified as legally married. There was never a question of them not being legally married. So yes, and I will say marriages between enslaved people were not as uncommon as you might think. And in fact, remember, this is a Puritan Congregationalist society. So sex outside of marriage is not it's something that they like to control. So, and that included even with the enslaved people the people they were enslaving. So they would much rather that, an enslaved person formed a family and had sex within the confines of marriage and family, rather than, having, fornication, which was defined as sex with an unmarried woman, was illegal. So, and in fact, Joshua Hempstead, our diarist, he was a justice of the peace, and he even married some enslaved people, and even in the house married some Native American and enslaved people in the house. So actually, marriages like the Jacksons were not uncommon.
And Maggie is asking, was it Adam's help that likely allowed Joshua to remain unmarried?
Another great question, Maggie. There is no doubt. So let me be clear. By the time Adam came to Joshua's house, most of the kids were already, well underway. So Joshua, his oldest son was the same age, his oldest surviving son was the same age as Adam. So they were both 27. So at that point, probably what I think actually, so it wasn't so much in taking care of his children. He actually relied on women for that. So he used hired girls, his sisters, his mother, pardon me, and also the sisters of his deceased wife. He placed the youngest children with the sisters of the deceased wife, which I find just so poignant, because they were kind of the closest thing to his wife that he could find. And then, but then he would bring them back as soon as he could. So, so he found other ways to take care of the kids. What Adam really did allow him to do, other than obviously taking care of a lot of the work of the farm, is it allowed him to, in later life, to expand his public role. So he really became a local figure that was relied on by the town to be a selectman, a representative to the General Assembly. He was a judge on the probate court. He was a judge on the county court. So, he was a man of some, local importance and that kind of thing. Without Adam, that would never have been possible.
And one of the attendees is asking if you can share your research journey with us.
Sure. So the diary that I showed you, it's a long journey, and I'm sure you don't want to hear all of it. The diary that I showed you, that is the manuscript, obviously. But I will tell you that, in fact, the diary was published first, I believe, in 1901. So it's been published for a long time. So I didn't have to spend all of my time wading through the manuscript. And frankly, the manuscript's too fragile for me to do that. So I really started with the diary, and I spent an entire year with just the diary, and I created my own index. And it was a people index, a subject index, but of the subjects that I was interested in, like, you know, fatherhood. It was also just learning who's who and what's what. You know, a lot of it's abbreviated. And as with our own, you know, if we were to write diaries, like, we know what we mean, but, you know, another reader might not have any idea. And so trying to, you know, get to know him, get to know the community, that took me a year. And I can tell you, like, my index, it's just volumes, it's thousands of pages. But that made me an expert on the diary and on Joshua. And that allowed me to then enter his world with that knowledge and that understanding of who he was and how he would react to things. And it was really court records that unlocked the world of the Jackson family, partly because there was all this litigation about them. And the experience of other enslaved people, because court records is where, you know, they don't really appear in town records because they're not property owners. They're not, you know, in transactions. They tend to not to be literate. They don't really appear too much in church records. So it's really hard to get any kind of living feeling of what the experiences of enslaved people. But where you find that is in court records. So I read 100 years of court records from the beginning of Connecticut till the death of Adam, which was actually in 1764, a few years after Joshua, to make sure that I read everything in New London from the entire period. And that's where I was able to really see enslaved people in action, in their lives, interacting with other people through depositions. And sometimes you actually can hear them speaking because they, you know, it's all transcribed phonetically. And you can hear the accent, you can hear how people are speaking to each other, what's the demeanor, you know, that kind of thing. And, you know, all of these records are fraught in the sense that they're, you know, they're created by the dominant culture and so on and so forth. But I find that, you know, you kind of get the purest moments or snapshots in these court records where people are speaking in their own words, often in this kind of Q&A format, you know, answering the question of the judge. So court records, town records, church records, and that was enough. That was enough.
Okay, and another person has asked, how difficult on your eyes was reading the diary? And were there any words that were unknown to you?
Wow. So I wouldn't say, so first of all, not as difficult as you might think. So that diary, the picture that I showed you, it's actually kind of legal size. So it's not as tiny, and even with a good magnifying glass, like, it's not so much that it's difficult to decipher or to see in that it's because it's small. I'd say the trickiest part are its abbreviations. So for instance, preached is PR. Often people's names are abbreviated. And it would, you know, I wouldn't say so much that there were words that I didn't understand. I mean, the language was pretty familiar. Sometimes when they're talking about trades or, like, you know, shipwriting, those kind of, you know, antiquated professional words, I would have to look up. But that wouldn't probably be it. It'd be more the idiom or his own personal idioms, you know, that were difficult. There was one time where he very rarely complained about Adam. Actually, in 30 years, only 3 times does he say anything even remotely negative about Adam, which is amazing. And one time, you know, I'm reading along and then it says, you know, they're out in the field, they're doing something. And he said, Adam was nothing today. And I read that first and I thought, what does that mean? And then I realized what he meant was, Adam didn't work very hard today. But it wasn't like a particularly strong way to say it. In the same way that when we read that little segment and it said, I went to meeting and something better. Like the first time you read that, you're like, what is he talking about? But I know him, and what he means is he's feeling a little better because he was a little peaked the other day. So that's really just from immersing yourself in it. The same way that you might, the way your mother's handwriting, I come to know Joshua, or I feel like I know him as well as I can.
And Cheryl is asking, did Adam continue to work for Joshua's children after Joshua's death?
I'm really glad that you asked that question. So, yeah, for enslaved people who had worked for a very long time for one family, the death of your master is a moment of great precarity, fear, danger, risk, because you can be sold. What can happen? So Joshua died when he was 80 years old. At that point, Adam was around 58. So would have been considered old, would have been considered not a prime worker, of prime working age, becoming difficult to employ. Joshua did not make provision for Adam to be freed when he died. And, I frantically, when the diary went silent, I also didn't have a window into where is Adam? What is he doing? But I did manage to find through other sources, he did stay within the collective Hempstead households, probably in the household of Joshua's son, John, who lived very nearby and was Joshua's executor, and John was a blacksmith. And then miraculously, I found Adam on the tax rolls. So Adam did secure his freedom. We don't know how exactly. Was he given it by John? Had there been an arrangement? We don't know. So in one way, I felt joy for Adam that he secured his freedom. But we also have to remember that, and this is kind of the dark side of what would happen with an older enslaved person. In New England, so by law, if you had a long-serving enslaved person in your family, you had to maintain them in old age by law. Now, people tried to shirk that. And so there were practices of freeing enslaved people at the time when they become kind of a burden. So essentially, freedom is then the freedom to be old, infirm, unable to work, poor. So, there's a little bit of ambiguity there in terms of what happened to Adam and what responsibility did the Hempsteads, take for him, after he had spent his life serving them. He disappears from the tax rolls in 1764. And he would have been 64, and I presume that he died. I have never found any record of him dying. But everything points to him remaining, even though he was technically free, and this would have been completely common, remaining as a servant, so indentured servant, within the Hempstead family. So freedom didn't mean now I get to go out and live my life and do this. And freedom meant being a servant, being poor, and kind of losing your security as well. So I'm not trying to diminish the worth of freedom, but it's just a bit more complicated in the practical implications.
And one last question, Allegra. Thank you so much for being so generous. In your research, were you able to connect with the descendants of the Hempstead or the Jackson family?
So I don't know of, there are, like, I was going to say millions, but probably not millions, probably thousands of Hempstead descendants. Many of them moved out to the Ohio Reserve when kind of land ran out in New England. So I've met many Hempstead descendants at various talks and everything, and have received some very warm communications from them. Sadly, so Adam never married. Adam, as far as we know, and we would know, I think Joshua would have written about it. As far as we know, he didn't have any children. He did have nieces and nephews. He did have a lot of siblings, some of whom married and had children. What happened with those descendants? And we don't know.
Okay.
So I wish they could be found, but that kind of wasn't my enterprise, but it would be wonderful.
I don't know. I think that's all the questions. Oh, wait. Yes, I think that is all the questions that we have for this evening. Thank you, Allegra and Maggie, the Museum of Darien. This was wonderful. This is just a fascinating and so eye-opening. We never think about slavery in New England.
Well, thank you so much, Pat and Maggie, for the opportunity to be here. And thank you everyone for coming. I hope it was fun and interesting and you learned something new.
And hopefully you'll visit us again, Allegra.
I would love to. Okay.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.